Okay, so welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. My guest today is coach extraordinaire, philosopher extraordinaire, Nick Jankel. Nick, welcome to the program.
Hello, Greg. It's such a divine and yet very this worldly pleasure to be in conversation with you. Since the time we first connected, I felt a real brotherhood in our work in both theory and practice, and how we blend those within ourselves and within the work.
Dude, man, I totally felt that. Spiritual atheism is a beautiful articulation and certainly speaks to my soul and where I've evolved from and to, and maybe where I'm headed. And I felt the exact same synergy. It's really kind of striking and remarkable at times. Like, oh my gosh, there's another guy living my life across the pond.
Exactly.
So one of the things that actually you and I haven't done a huge amount that, kind of I like to do in these kinds of settings is just to hear the story of the person in relationship to how they got here and what were some of the kind of driving forces or transformative moments that brought them and what makes, things alive for you. So maybe we can begin there.
I love that last bit there. That's the practitioner in you. What brings things alive for you? And then boom, I'm like, yeah. I mean, where do we start? I have a kind of strangely, I've been told, meta-modern story of my own biographical journey. Which I didn't know that term until someone said to me, you've got a meta-modern biography. I was like, yay for me. So long story short, I grew up fairly standardly in a kind of semi-religious Jewish upbringing. It wasn't fully religious. It was reform. It was progressive. Right. It was. My dad was absolutely not into that. He was a card-carrying behavioral psychologist and Marxist.
Okay.
And still is. And my mother was a humanistic psychotherapist and social worker. So
you were born into the psychological world, huh?
I was, and yet I was born into these two polarities: the Skinnerian behaviorist, who cares what's going on inside, let's give you a carrot and a stick and we'll make some change happen. And then there's this sort of, but just tell me how it's feeling for you in the humanistic thing.
You mean there's a split in psychology around those domains? I hadn't heard that.
That schism became the divorce of my parents when I was a fairly young age. So wrap that in.
That's metaphorical, huh?
Exactly. Nothing like as below, so above, and vice versa. So then I kind of, was wounded, a wounded soul. Have since realized how sensitive and artistic I was, and that wasn't really available as a archetype.
Right.
Which maybe we'll come back to, because it's something that I'm really dwelling on around animus.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say necessarily the girl in me, but the feminine energy and the they in me, I think would be a better way of saying it.
Nice.
A non-binary part of me. Anyway, carried on. Decided around 13 I was going to have psychotherapy. It was kind of decided for me because I was a fairly maladapted person, socially, a lot of anger, a lot of rage. Went into psychotherapy for 3 years, pretty traditional post-Freudian. Didn't really get into it, really, if I'm honest with you. Didn't really get into those areas. I tried it again a few times, but didn't ever quite get there. It was very because it was all about the cognitive layer.
Didn't go into the heart and body.
Didn't really get into my heart and body. I don't think that was part of the conversation. And there's only, as we know, there's only a certain amount, or not everyone knows, there's only a certain amount of change that can happen through cognitive reflecting.
If it stays up here,
If it stays up here. But I decided to be a doctor, and I decided to be a psychiatrist around that time.
Really?
So I was like, might as well do the royal path of this psychology thing. And long story short, rejected my Jewishness, became an atheist around 15. That's when my book Spiritual Atheist starts. I'm in the synagogue and I'm reading some bits of what I now know as Kabbalistic wisdom. At the back of the prayer book, there were just these little bits people selected.
Right.
I'm going, this is really interesting, but this 2-hour thing that I'm going through, super boring, patriarchal, not getting it, doing nothing for me, no meaning, no vibe, neither meaning nor energy. There's neither. So I popped out, went to Cambridge, which, as I describe it in various places, is like the high altar of atheism.
Really?
Like
Okay.
if you want to go to Cambridge and do dolphin music and tribal drumming, it's going to be a really challenging ride for you. People did, but I don't know any in the medical and scientific campus I was in, right?
Wow. Okay.
So I'm studying medicine, I'm studying psychology, I'm studying all this great stuff. And then a couple of things happened that were really like what we would now call bifurcation points in my life.
Okay.
What I called at the time breakdowns, because I didn't have the tools.
Well, in retrospect.
Yeah, I didn't know how.
Right, when you're in it.
The tools of transformation allow you to see, preempt that what you think is a breakdown, a crisis, a burnout, a collapse is actually, and this is as above, so below, so socially as psychologically, these are all opportunities for upgrade of consciousness, for transformational upgrades. I say that obviously because of the collapsology we're in at the moment, you know, as a society.
Right.
And a couple of the themes, and a couple of the things that came out were, one, medical science didn't have enough to resolve my not just psychological challenges, but I then by then had been diagnosed with a chronic pain syndrome called fibromyalgia. And I was ironically studying rheumatology at the time. So literally the head of rheumatology at one of the world's best hospitals had nothing for me, right?
Wow.
I wasn't even sure fibromyalgia existed. You know, it took me about 5 years for anyone to commit to that being something. At the same time, I was going through a collapse of my relational experiences with myself, with the world, and with women. And that precipitated me to leave the medical world.
Okay.
However, one thing had happened, a stroke of luck / Jungian synchronicities had occurred. In the Cambridge system, you get to choose 1 year to choose something that isn't medicine. And most medics choose neurobiology, cognitive science, whatever. I don't know quite how. I managed to study history and philosophy of science with a specialism in history and philosophy of social science. So suddenly I'm reading Kuhn and I'm reading Foucault and I'm reading Derrida, or trying to read Derrida. I should bracket, try.
You can get the cliff notes on Derrida.
I'm reading critiques of psychoanalysis. I'm reading evolutionary psychology and critiques of evolutionary psychology. Can you deconstruct evolutionary theory? You know, suddenly, and this was the first time in my life I went from being generally curious. I've always loved learning. Like, give me anything to learn, I'll find something interesting in it. But suddenly, sparks were flying. I was kind of running to the university library every morning after a night of partying. I should add that as a big part of the journey. I mean that actually. I mean that I spent a year in Africa and I really got a community relational field I'd never experienced before. And I'd also been diving into what we could now call consciousness medicines, nice reframe, and experiencing the rave scene in England, which at the time was a fundamentally new form of relating, peer-to-peer, where people from different races and classes, and you remember England's a very class-based society, as is America. I think we should be clear. So I was ending up hanging out in apartments of people from really, I would say without being judgmental for myself, the underclass of the left behind, the forgotten. I don't see them as underclass, but I think they would.
No, at a structural level, sure.
The left behind, basically. So that was shifting my whole world. And then
about what time is this? This is what time are we?
This was the 90s. 90s was my sort of time. Which I think is interesting because there's also I call the 90s peak. You could call it peak JetBlue. Where we didn't think twice about flying off to a city break. Carbon? Who's heard about carbon? You know, no one cares, right?
Yeah, it's the Clinton years for us over here. It's like, woohoo!
Totally. You know? It was peak capitalism, peak convenience, peak everything, right? And so I left medicine, and part of the call to leave was not just the leaving of something that wasn't working, it was also the attraction to a PhD or something in history of consciousness. I applied to UC Santa Cruz, to the anthropology program at Berkeley, where what's his name, Paul was it Paul Ricoeur or something was studying. So I got pulled into what you could call meta theory, for want of a better term, right? And that actually then started to inform my pragmatic life, because suddenly I didn't do a PhD. I've now say I've done multiple PhDs, but not in a university. Don't have the thing on the back on my wall. So I got pulled into. So if you imagine, I've been studying how revolutions happen. Thomas Kuhn, classics of the genre. I got pulled into an advertising agency that was a specialist in creating disruptive brands.
Interesting. Okay.
Which is a practice of how you create paradigm shift, how you create whatever version of that, epistemic shocks, whatever.
Transformations.
Transformation. So that was fun. A lot of consumer research going on. So I kept my hand in being with people.
Right.
Then I was asking to facilitate difficult groups where you're trying to take CEOs who are wedded to one view of the world and try and upgrade them before a 23-year-old from Stanford upgrades their market for them.
Right.
Which is fascinating, right? So you're living disruption, you're living quantum revolutions over and over again.
Wow.
That then pulled me into facilitating groups and holding groups, and that pulled me into more general innovation work and then leadership work.
Wow.
And then the leadership work pulled me back into coaching. Then I started developing my own one-to-one practice, both for executive coaching, but also for individual transformational coaching, which, guess what, but totally without plan, brought me right back to psychiatry, but just a different door into it. And that's, mass or menace, the main story, but countless hours of self-inner work on this journey, And then now with my wife of 10 years, who is my business partner, and that has really affected my work, because she comes from the non-academic. Right. She has a bachelor's degree, but she's a dancer, elite gymnast, a US team gymnast, choreographer, and then became a non-verbal craniosacral therapist. So no speaking, holding hands, holding near body sensing nervous systems.
Wow.
Trauma healing, basically.
Right, trauma healing.
And 10 years ago, we collided, and we've been doing a individual, personal, family, and business marriage of the anima, animus, the masculine, the feminine, the relational, the rational. I've changed her, she's changed me, and wholeness. Something like wholeness is approaching. I can, some version of that.
Right. I'll just pause on that for a second. That's beautiful. At multiple levels. Actually, why don't we go a couple of comments? Let me make a couple of comments. So in terms of living parallel lives, so it is in the 1990s that when I enter into psychotherapy as a trainer, so I get getting trained in psychotherapy, that I then find this weird space between practice, theory, and research. Okay. And that is when my empiricism, when it dawns on me, wait a minute, broken empiricism and a multiplicity of different ideas and paradigms in the therapy room at a conceptual level actually just creates chaos, really. Right. An enormous amount of chaos. And there are all these history of ideas that are impinging upon us in a particular way and just swirling around. And we can pull out interesting findings, but at a coherent sense-making level that connects heart, mind to other in a healing way, it's a shit show.
I'm glad you said that. I want to share a scene with you. So, no surprise, in the history of science, my favorite paper, a paper as a program, my favorite program was the history of psychoanalysis, which was run by probably the most respected Freud scholar in the world.
Okay.
Who I think is no longer with us. So I'm not happy just to listen to the read the 13 books, do some bit of meta criticism, and then write a paper and I'm off. I want to find the map, right? And I think this is where you and I have we love practice. Practice is so important, but if you don't have a map of where you're going with people, what are we doing practicing? You know, where are we? We're just walking around. Oh, it's a nice tree. Oh, it's a nice beach. Okay. So we want a map. We know it's not the territory, but it's rooted in the territory. A good map should be a lift direct and be currently constantly informed by the territory, right?
Totally.
Updated all the time. It's one of the nightmares of my work with Alison on this transformation map of human transformation is it needs to be updated all the time because whole new bits of information are popping up all over the map constantly. The language we use, everything. Anyway, picture the University Library at Cambridge. It's like the main library. It's kind of, you can imagine, you know, Ivy League. It's kind of sexy and romantic and old worldly and leather. I'm not into leather, but it was leather, a lot of leather bound.
Yeah, you're getting fired up here, Nick.
And you can just sort of see ladies, just kind of half see them over there, and there's like dark light. There's dark lights with a little green glass. You see them in
Of course, that's
movies of Washington DC all the time, right? So that's probably a name for it.
I'm set in the scene.
You got there. So I've got post-it notes, and I'm trying to create a map of Freud's, essentially Freud's map, which he didn't actually have, right? This is the great joke of Freud. He had bits of map that were probably more influenced by his own upbringing. Anyway, I'm trying to make sense of an area where sense has not yet been made. Okay. Plus, I'm reading sort of Lacan's critiques of all this sort of stuff. Then I'm reading let's say, critical thinking's critique of psychoanalysis as a whole cult I went through a like vortex rabbit hole of epistemic breakdown, but not in a sexy way, not in a disruptive a phoenix rose from the death of the old. The rebirth didn't occur at that stage. There was just death. Like there was just death.
Right.
Just death.
You got swallowed by the death instinct.
Totally. Thanatos ruled. And and the irony is, this was my paper where I put more time than you could imagine into it, and I got the least good marks because I didn't have yet enough sense making.
Right.
To make sense. But the irony is, why I say it's the practice of psychotherapy didn't then have enough sense itself. Right. So how could I create a map of a mapless territory being 19, or 21, 20 something, whatever. So anyway, I can feel that same sense.
That's exactly right. Yeah, no, it's a total parallel.
There's so much not enough actually. There's so much, I was actually on your webinar last night. And
really?
Yeah. And I was so excited to hear that. So I spent the last 20 years trying to understand how brain science could create an underlying solidity of which different practices and theories and inner wisdoms can all collect without becoming a reductionist and making everything about the movement of ions across a neural pathway. And I was so inspired to hear the four of you talking about how you, as pioneers of psychotherapy as a field, and given that I do quite deep transformational inner child psychodynamic trauma healing coaching, it's psychotherapy, right? But I can't call it that.
Of course. Yeah, no,
okay.
Right. I'm not ready. I may give up my license, by the way, because if we really actually need to get this stuff generalized, not out of the goddamn professional
but just hearing you guys and us all coming to the same conclusions: reconsolidation, massive; neuroplasticity, massive; the different brain networks, massive; the effect of trauma on learning. And I was like, pop, pop, pop. Everyone is now, I hope, consolidating around a core process of transformation, around which the different methods and approaches can cluster. And that's what I feel I've achieved, I guess, is to understand that process, both as a practitioner, to feel my way along it with someone, as a guide or advisor, coach, whatever, but actually now to both describe the process in my first book, and then Spiritual Atheist was actually the metaphysics you need to believe that process can exist. Because there's part of it which you guys labeled yesterday, the corrective emotional experience. That for me is where spirituality pops in, because that is the alpha and omega of corrective emotional experiences. And I know psychotherapy still wants to be a science, so it can't really bring this mysticism in.
Well, we can talk about how it can do that if it's framed correctly. Okay, let's figure out how this. So this is great. Thank you for attending that. I was very encouraged. I think there is something that's happening at numerous levels that are forwarding the system opportunities for stepping forward and maybe generating a theory, research, practice intersection that's actually up to the task of having a coherent map and model that does justice to the territory in the right sort of way. And that's really exciting. I mean, that's never happened. You and I obviously both, and I've talked to other people, I think you and I carry this in a particular kind of resonant way. It's absent. I mean, this is what I flip out. I'm haunted by the problem of psychology, what I call, I can't understand why people don't care about it on the one hand. It's like we're all the, theories of everything, quantum mechanics, general relativity. Listen, folks, if Ed Witten or whoever, some mathematical genius manages that, your lives don't change at all. And the meaning of the fight you just had with your wife doesn't change at all. Okay, it's like, but the idea that we don't know what mind and matter is in a scientific sense with any degree of coherence then speaks to things like corrective emotional experiencing and the longing for spiritual enlightenment and connection and what that means from the wisdom tradition. Absolutely. I mean, and there's no capacity to talk with any kind of coherence in relationship to the bridge from the atomic field of matter, which we know about scientifically, into the evolution of ourselves as organisms, into animals, into primates, into persons. And then what does it mean for us to be here today and to look out at what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis and wonder what the fuck we're doing, and seeing so many people, I mean, suicides on an epidemic rate, depression and anxiety. There's just an unbelievable shattering of connection in certain ways and a shriveling of our souls. So, Nick, help us with the metaphysics of spirituality. And
well, I mean, as below, so above, right? So I experienced this. I call it a schism in my work, or the double bind, which is a famous understanding, right?
Of course. Mm-hmm. Actually, we should tell people very quickly what the double bind is.
So the double bind is
no, don't tell them that.
Okay.
Oh wait, no, go ahead and tell them.
Well, I'll speak it in a different way to make it less part of my reformation and coming away from the addiction of cognition and the addiction of cleverness and the addiction of rational complexity, meta theories, grand narratives, whatever you want to call it. I'm coming out of that addiction. And part of it for me is to be able to say things simply but no simpler, and not create language and lingo and meaning structures that disassociate and disembody myself,
right,
and therefore fragment others, and create more what I've called this patriarchy games, like the desire to go up and up and up. And I get it because I've had that desire all my life, but part of it's been trauma driven, and I'm really owning that at the moment, right?
Right.
So for me, there's a schism, super simply, between what we feel our hearts intuit when we're quiet enough to hear our hearts intuiting away,
right,
and what our minds think is real and concrete from our empirical understanding that has then been lensed by the modern scientific project.
Totally.
Mediated by. So we've basically been told in the atheistic world of science that only what you can measure exists. Bottom line. And if you can't measure it, who cares? Which hence gives the psychology gap, because you have a science of consciousness that doesn't believe in consciousness, which is one of the funniest ironies of the world today.
Hey, we're trying to make sense out of shit over here, Nick.
Totally. So we're going to use a method created for measuring matter to try and understand mind, which we don't even agree what it is or know what it is. In fact, we don't even really think it exists, most of us. We think it's just an epiphenomenon, but you don't even know what that is either, because that means it exists, but it can't exist because it's just neurons firing, ... Anyway, the schism is between, when I put it really simply, when I hold my child in my arms, or when I did, because I don't do it very often, although I had to recently because I was in A&E with my son, and these are really liminal moments, which / peak experiences, whatever you want to call these moments, right? Where the veil of everyday bullshit is pierced by crisis or by love or by drugs, whatever, right?
Right.
So when we feel our child, or we stand on a mountain, or we are in a flow like the movie Soul when they're playing piano, you know, or we are in a festival dancing with random people, hugging them, whatever these moments. When you're in a therapy session, right, and you get a moment of our hearts intuit that there is something there which is not measurable by science, or we can operationalize or instrumentalize the measurement of it, but it's not it. Totally. That's what we intuit. But our minds say we're not allowed to have that thought, particularly if you've grown up in a scientific tradition where you have to discount all of it or reduce it to, you know, some kind of reductionist version of mindfulness or this or that. And I love knowing that gray matter increases in the amygdala area when we do meditation, but it's just it's an affirmation of what's real. It's not what's real, right? So we have this schism on the individual level,
right, with
ourselves.
Yes.
So my heart and my mind are no longer, not me now, but prior to 15 years ago, my heart and my mind, they're just metaphors, but you know, my rational thought and my relational feeling about life are not aligned.
Totally.
That schism goes out into the next level of complexity.
That's right.
In my relationships. Then it goes out into the next level of complexity in enterprises, institutions, projects, then into systems, and it goes backwards also into our relationship to that which is deep within us. Totally. And I think you can reach the mystical that way up into transcendent and that way down into immanent. And ultimately they come back on like a full, totally like a full arc somewhere in the cosmos. There's an arc going on, there's a circle meeting. The sky and the earth meet, you know, that's the beauty of the immanence and the transcendence. And so this schism affects everything. And until we repair the schism, because it's just a schism in relationship, well, not just, it is a schism in relationship. It's not schism in rational thought. So we can't repair it with mind. The mind can help us understand what and how and why. And then at some point we have to stop thinking and do work, experiential work. And until we do that on the individual level, honestly, I don't think anything will tangibly change, even if we create a Bitcoin that plants trees, or we're going to create a theory of everything. Doesn't matter. Any of that stuff will not help us regenerate our world until we do this, what I'm calling now the great repair, that starts within and then reaches out across these relational fields, loved ones, people like, you know, us in communitas, in fellowship, citizens as a whole, earth.
Beautiful. And so I feel now compelled to articulate what is the sort of guiding light, at least for the first part of this podcast, which is that I'm engaged in dialogue, deep dialogue and relation, in search of a coherent naturalistic ontology that can revitalize the human soul and spirit in the 21st century. It seems to me, Nick, you have things to say about that.
I want to say amen.
Oh, all right. Well, right, we can just...
Oh, my God, of great irony. But maybe I should say the kind of West Coast hippie version, aho.
Aho.
Just to appropriate someone else's culture I don't understand.
Well, hey, now we're going to get emails.
Exactly. So, yes. I mean, I love that sentence. So, again, let's unpack the first bit, because the second bit is the language of relation, the language of love. So you've created a sentence that already marriages, chemically marriages, mysterium conjunctionis of Jung, brings the masculine and feminine together, right? So let's unpack that. Yep. And that's the work, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got an ontology, a metaphysics, and a way of understanding what is and what being is and who we are and how it all works. That's naturalistic. And this is really interesting because I think you and I, again, agree, because a lot of people who are doing this bridging, probably less wedded to a naturalistic ontology than I think you and I are.
Yep, definitely.
And I think we both agree that naturalism doesn't have to be the materialist, reductionist naturalism of the last, and it's only been the last 100 years. People don't seem to realize in the history of science, the early scientists didn't have such a scientismist view.
Totally. Right.
That emerged like Victorian times. It wasn't even really with the new atheists, when it became rigid and unflexible and so unsexy. But that's another conversation.
No, well, I mean, actually, yeah. So, I mean, the coherent naturalistic ontology, right? Let's spend some time deconstructing where I definitely is naturalistic rather than physicalist or materialist.
Exactly.
Right? So I did a blog a little while ago and sort of diagnosed a taxonomy of 4 different worldviews, scientific worldviews. So you can have a theological worldview, say dualist classic Christian worldview. There's that, and any number. When I say science, I do mean the modern empirical natural science enterprise that emerges in Western Europe and gives us the Newtonian physics, which then does, in my opinion, serve as a ground for a particular type of epistemological process that generates a particular kind of ontology. That I think in Roy Bhaskaar's correct framing gives us a transcendent realism, or the possibility of a transcendent realism. What I mean by that is I think that we've transcended at least the normal human cultural contextual variables of knowing with modern science in a different sort of way. And so I think that the atomic theory of matter, for instance, the idea that there's, after the Big Bang, you get hydrogen and helium and a little bit of lithium. That I think is actually an ontology that's far beyond our just normal human knowing, but it's afforded through the processes of experimentation, quantitative analysis, yields a particular picture of reality that I think is a map that really corresponds. And if there were other intelligent beings that use deductive reasoning or some analogy to it, they too would arrive at something very much akin to the atomic theory of matter. Okay.
And they have, according by some readings, that there is an atomic theory of matter in a number of wisdom traditions that is culturally specific to that.
Right. And other traditions. I was actually thinking of alien life forms in that regard. So if we met an alien life form that had deductive capacities, I think that that's a great question about how much our human epistemology swallows, and the phenomena of understanding swallows the ontology. Roy Bhaskaar criticizes a strong version of Kantianism that says, hey, epistemology more or less has to be the ground of knowing. At least that's a potential argument. And Roy, I think, makes a very good case that says, no, actually, we can actually infer ontological claims beyond our human phenomenology. That's a great, anyway, less technical and more just embodied is sort of like, I commit to a particular naturalism. There emerged in what I consider just an unworkable physical reductionism. Okay. Where we see the eliminative materialism, that is what makes consciousness really dismissed in certain ways. It's just, we know that it's all physical, mechanical matter and motion process, and everything else stacked on top of it isn't really real. The real ontology is just the base, and this is just an illusion or an epiphenomenon. That's what I call scientific worldview A, and I just think it's completely misguided. And really, when you push the people, although the culture sort of absorbs that. I had a nephew that came back from college and I learned I was just a bunch of chemicals. Okay, so you can hear that. I don't think many, there are a few, but not many serious scientists and philosophers take scientific worldview A, although it's understood sort of simplistically as the version of science. Then you get scientific worldview B, which is adopted by the normative mainstream, I argue. Sean Carroll is an articulation, gives good articulation of this. This says, yes, our best ontology is in the core of, say, quantum mechanics, general relativity, core theory stuff. And then we have a pragmatic emergent process that's real in some ways, and then it's helpful to talk about. He calls that poetic naturalism, but he's fine with substituting materialism or physicalism in with naturalism.
Totally.
Okay? That's scientific worldview B, and I think that's the dominant scientific worldview that's operative. It's got a weak emergence in it, but really is essentially pictorially in relationship to now what I'll put scientific worldview C is it would depict matter into life, into mind, into a single culture of complexification. I mean, cone of complexification, so that it's all really kind of layers of reduction. Okay. In fact, the unity of science, the logical positivists, talked about the layered cake or layered ontology model, and it was just a layers of system. The tree of knowledge gives us a new ontology, and it says no. If when we go from particle energy into then matter, and we go from particles into atoms into chemistry across scale, yes, that's a kind of emergence. But then when we jump into life, okay, something new is happening in the universe at life, and that's a new epistemic process. So life actually is a kind of cognition from this vantage point. It's a kind of information processing and then communication between systems that creates a negentropic causal feedback loop. Okay, that's a new kind of causation that is not present in physical science. Okay, and so and that means that there's a generative ontological process that is between dimensions, which is not within dimensions. So it requires a different idea of what emergence is. So it's interdimensional emergence. And it says also there's a knowing process now that's activated at the biophysiological level. Then the tree of knowledge says at the mind level, the neuro information processing, and then the behavior of the animal as a whole and its sensory motor functions. And then finally, at the cultural process level, talking and the connection of intersubjectivity through the highway of language is yet another knowing process. Okay. So what that means is that if you take that seriously, you say, yeah, no, there isn't an ontological reduction. Okay. This conversation is absolutely not an epiphenomenon of quantum process. Right. This conversation resides in a complex adaptive plane of existence that actually doesn't reduce to the animal mental layer. It actually resides at the cultural person level. The justification systems operate as wholes that can't be broken down into words or letters or sounds, but actually operate at a form level. And you and I, as information processors at the culture person level, okay, are engaged in a new ontological process, just like animals are, just like cells were. And so that scientific worldview C has a different kind of emergence, and it makes different kinds of ontological claims that says emergence is not just a weak or epistemological, there's actually interdimensional ontological emergence at the level of cause. That's what that means then is that this conversation and all of its engendered potentially has an ontological status that's anything but epiphenomenal. It's essential potentially. Then there's scientific worldview D, which then says, yeah, you can't materialistically describe this conversation. There must be a universe of consciousness or a God. And there's
that's where the coin. So you got the tree in C, and then the coin is in D, because the tree still is missing something, right? The interiority.
Right. Well, the tree, right. So but I argue that this is right. I argue that the tree of knowledge, which then represents a scientific ontology, which then the coin represents our ideographic subjective souls.
Absolutely.
That's what I would use the term soul there.
And had a materialistic jada.
Yeah. Right. But for what I mean by that is if you have the right ontology of the mind and matter relation, it makes perfect sense that we can build models of consciousness and self. I've done that with John Vervaeke.
Yeah.
Now, however, what people need to understand is you need to build a scientific generalized model of what those entities are. Okay. But science is always about the general and abductive reasoning of general process. It's never about idiosyncratic, unique, particular histories that are unreliable.
There's no science of an individual.
And so here we are. But my life matters, Nick.
Oh, absolutely. Just not to science.
Just not to science. So we actually, if the language game of science a priori says, absolutely, I can't see you, then it has a gap. It has a hole. Absolutely. It has an epistemological gap to my unique idiosyncratic soul. That hole is filled by the coin. Okay. Yes. And then, and the other thing that science clearly can't say is how ought to we live, as what is the narratives and values, ethical values we live by. So, and that's of course what I struggle with in the practice domain that you undoubtedly get, is like, well, what ought to we do? What do we value? What ought to we do? Science just says, well, this is what it is from some distant objective standpoint that's inductive. So it doesn't carry subjectivity, and it doesn't carry ethical narrative. And the garden in the unified theory of knowledge, UTOK, the garden is the placeholder for what would represent a wisdom, ethical, shared mythopoetic narrative of being that would then, and then finally, I'll say for me, then my soul then orients towards that. And to the extent that I realize that transcendent collective, that's my spirit. And the bridge then from my soul to the spirit is when I'm aligned with whatever the ultimate good would be, and it shines back on me.
Yeah. Oh, love that. I love the last bit. That was then the poetic naturalism came back in there, and it shines back on me, right? I know the face of God because it is me. The Conference of the Birds, the Sufi story, they go off searching for God, oneness, spirit, and they go through all these journeys which are metaphors of maladaptive pattern transformation,
right?
And then each bird represents a pattern, and then the last birds that are still going on get to the door of this where they think where they're going, and they get let in, and they're trying to find this specific kind of bird, and then they're inside the palace temple. I forget, is a lake, and they look into the lake and they see themselves. Like,
I don't know the story. Beautiful.
You are God.
Right.
You are the one. You are the mystery. And it's inside you, and that interiority just doesn't occur even in a science game C.
Right. No,
that's that not interiority doesn't have quality. It doesn't have qualia. And this is the schism that I was feeling, right? So back to this kind of very personal version of it, which is how can I exist in a world of is that has no ought, and yet I feel ought, and I feel social bond, I feel limbic resonance, I feel the desire for compassion, kindness, and love, and service and purpose. But there's no such thing in the materialist or even emergent scientific worldview that isn't somehow taking away the center of them. But then we have the other part of the double bind, which is we then built a scientific worldview that was based upon value-free isness. We wanted to get rid of our value as breathing, thinking scientists who could interrupt the flow of direct empirical knowledge with biases and with theology, ultimately. But then we built ourselves this cathedral, as I said recently, but no space to open our hearts within it. And
a metaphor, yes.
Yeah, it came, as channeled, or not, who knows? And so so much to say from what you just said. So one of the things that I wanted to do with my metaphysical work, which I do separate to some degree from my practitioner work, in that the process of transformation that I think myself and now Alison have unfolded, or discovered and constructed, totally up for knowing there's part of it we've constructed with our myths, stories, language, Western weird psychological thinking. Right. That's the process, right? You can be any form of religion, no religion, to modern religion, and that's the process of transformation. Right. And it is in some ways orthogenic in that it does want to go up towards the sun, to be in some way unfolded and unfold, and fixations and distortions relieved, and freedom, psychological and an energetic release of all that trauma and repressed behavior and sadness and grief and whatever and then we can serve, and then we want to heal the whole and be part of the whole, and then we see it back to us, right? It's shining its face on us. I totally agree. And metaphysics is so important to that, but it actually is irrelevant. So you can learn how to guide the process of transformation to unfold without any of that.
Right.
And you and I both know that's not enough if we want to get out of this, because that could still be all kind of discounted by a strong reductionist. and it's not enough. So then I thought to myself, there must be a soul for this. And that came from I guess a theological, but I wouldn't call it religious, true knowing, which was, I know we're all one and everything is one to some degree. And the beauty of this is, I remember sitting in my set, which is the word for like your digs at Cambridge, with my two friends who are now professional historians. They're both intellectual historians.
Okay.
And I remember saying to them, once you've deconstructed science, or human science, and you have laid waste to any grand narrative that has any form of power and control within it, then what? Which is the great vacuum from which people like Jordan Peterson have arisen, because people have been lost in this deconstructive cycle downwards, where you can criticize anything and lay waste to any structure, but then you have to build something, because it's not enough to be science. It's not enough to deconstruct then we still have to have a shelter and some food and a cooking and some form of community cohesion process.
Sounds like you have a meta-modern sensibility, Nick.
Oh, hello. Exactly. Well, I do and I don't, I think. So okay. I think, right. Or I should say, I think there's a meta-modernism that is not yet emergent.
Right. Okay.
That I align with, where the cognitive complexity has been matched by expansions of our embodied wisdom, of our relationality.
Yes. Okay.
And then I think I'd be a metamodernist.
Beautiful.
In that, if modern is the pursuit of the rational, I mean, you could describe 1,000 versions of modern, but let's just say it's the pursuit of the rational and the break from the theological and let's say empirical past.
Okay.
And postmodernism, as many have said, is just a form of modernism turned back on itself.
Yeah.
It's not a genuinely new type of thinking. Then for metamodernism to get off this runway of modernity, which basically leads to meaning crisis, depression, stress, schism, war, and let's not forget the constant consumption of the earth and this spewing out of carbon and pollution through that process. If you want to get off that runway, we can't just have thought alone. We have to marry the thought back into the intuition, the heart, the feeling, the relationship, the presence, the being here with you.
Totally. As
Gregg, not me as thinker and you as thinker.
Coin to coin from bottom up, brother.
Coin to coin from bottom up. Exactly. Interoceptively up. Yes. And what I mean by that, for those who don't know what interoception is, it's the emerging science of our felt senses, which is one of the many places I'm now seeing where a deeply mystical view of the world and a deeply, let's call it naturalist view of the world, collide. And that's the kind of naturalism that I think you and I are aligned on, which is if there's any one thing, and I'm a non-dualist, a radical non-dualist, I believe there's only one thing, then the most amazingly uncanny parts of consciousness, so near-death experiences, psychedelic experiences, intuition, deja vu, and this is why I come back to that story I gave you about being in the creative industries, the actual experience and reality of creativity itself cannot be described by a reductionist view, have to meet somewhere back in the body, this body, in this kind of what people call expansive naturalism. So a naturalism that is not wedded just to matter stuff. It also is interested in consciousness stuff. And I would go one step further, and I hold a position that I am now calling dual aspect non-duality, which in the book I call dual aspect monism, and I realize that's not the case. It's a dual aspect non-duality, where I believe everything's one, but it shows up everywhere in two. But it's still only one. But we can study the two. So I can study consciousness from the inside of me. And I can study matter by turning my gaze through a microscope back onto me. fMRI, X-ray, microscope, whatever. And those two are always one, but always two. And I use the Mobius strip as the metaphor for this on the front of the book. Always two, always one, right? It's always one strip.
Love it.
It's always two sides, which then allows us to be panpsychists, but without thinking that a rock is going to have a dialogos with me.
Right.
I mean, it might do, but I may not be. I may not be sensitive enough to pick up its genius. I would say.
Right.
But I love that rock, let me tell you. And then I think the coin in the tree the coin's in the tree, but you can't see it by staring at the tree.
Totally.
You'll never, and this is where so in the book Spiritual Atheist, I did say at one point, much as my masculine, what I call control and protect mode or analytical consciousness,
okay,
much as it wants to circle the square of where spirit and matter or consciousness and matter collide, right. And it might be the Penrose and Hameroff microtubule theory. It may not be. It might be in interoceptive awareness. It might not be. It's a false question created by the masculine in me because I don't need to know.
Right.
And that might be the inherent mystery that the mystics speak of is the mystery, right?
Yeah.
It's called the mystery traditions for a reason, because inherent, our partial analytical mind is constantly trying to understand our unitive, connective cosmic consciousness, as William James called it. Mm-hmm. And there's always a mystery because the partial can't fully understand the whole. And I'm happy in those moments to follow Wittgenstein's dictum and, discuss it playfully, but not need to solve for it, because that's more of the masculine, modern masculine, rather than the relational feminine. And I think metamodern, I hope, for me, a metamodernism that's really metamodern is a marriage of our cognitive complexity going up and up and up to greater levels of capacity that is rooted and tempered and expanded by our relational wisdom, our embodied wisdom. Because to then jump another thing, I don't believe we can enter what, Wilbur calls second tier consciousness without relational wisdom. I don't think it's possible to be teal or anything like that.
Yep, totally. So that's wonderful and very. So let me riff off of that for a little bit, see where it takes us. So a couple of things here. So one thing is, I did an as above, so below transition in October. I was in a, quasi mystical. I get into these sort of mystical, enlightened places.
Absolutely.
Over a 10-year, maybe 10 different times in my journey over the last 25 years, and October was definitely one of them.
Accidentally or intentionally?
It depends. It's sort of like historically I am really driven by the logos. I mean, that's my path is driven by. So I have a feminine and feminist therapist heart, but I have a physicist head that wants that analysis. And
I know
that moment.
That's why we so get each other.
Totally, totally. But I then charge myself, and with the tree of knowledge, and then I've been off on that, and then but my clinical feminine heart's always grounding you back into what I meant. People are suffering. This is definitely. Wait a minute. People are suffering,
and that brings that masculine back.
It just sort of says, you cannot seek truth in and of itself. It's truth in the service of wisdom, and wisdom ought to be in service of the alleviation of suffering and the orient toward the good.
Which is relationship.
Which is relation in relationship to nature, relationship to other, relationship to my body. And the idea, the abstraction of it, and the reduction of everything to the abstraction of it in some pure form is annoying as shit to this part of me. Even as much my other parts, like, oh my God, I can figure this shit out. It's a very
before I jumped on this, I was having a hug, reunion with my wife. I haven't seen for like 48 hours. We've seen each other. We haven't been together.
Right.
And I was like, having had this sort of quite profound upgrade of my own developmental stage in the last month, which we can share in a second. I want to come back to you, but I was like, wow, you women must be really like, not just the Me Too pain of the masculine out of control in a toxic / traumatized way. Toxic and traumatized are the same, right?
Yeah.
And you must be also just kind of bored of us masculine freaks going off into grand narrative, going off into, cognitive clouds, and we can't be here with you. And she was like, yeah, you think that's all? You think what we talk about in our women's circles? And I was like, I get it. It took me 47 years to get it, but I get it. Right. Carry on. So you had one of these mystical.
So anyway, and it was called Wisdom Energy. It was. I stumbled into.
We spoke just when you were in the height.
Yeah, you taught. Yes,
I totally remember it.
Totally. Yeah. Right. I was like,
you're like speaking in tongues.
Yeah, and I was just, and what happened was it was a complete. I did a Moebius loop, and I was actually more relative to any other time that I've been in one of these. I'm normally just chattering. Usually, my hypomanic left hemisphere interpreter is just going off. Not this time. This time it was definitely a heart and embodied. So the wisdom looped back into energy, and I got and then I expanded really from below. So I'd go on walks. And I would just watch and be present in the silence of it all. I was overcome. I talked with John, and I was like, oh my God, he was like, this is kind of like Taoism and everything else. I was like, actually, it's philosophia. It's loving, knowing, but just as being, I was loving being without memory or desire. Yes. I was just
being a judder of jouissance.
Yes, completely. It was really, so that was cool. I love the point. The other thing I want to say is, I don't know how much you followed Lene Rachel Anderson's view on meta-modernity, but I really love it. Not surprisingly, she's a woman. She brings a particular angle, which I find to be very nourishing. And I see, so she divides the evolution of cultural consciousness up into 4 different phases, which I think is really beautiful. And I think we can spin feminine relative to masculine energies in these phases.
Yeah, they kind of like alternate, right?
Well, actually, here's one way of thinking about it. One way of thinking about it is that you have a relative balance in the oral indigenous frame of being, which is, and then actually, if you look at Venus figures and other things prior to agriculture, there's an argument that maybe the early horticultural systems were actually matriarchal. So I'm going to go with that and say, actually, embeddedness in relation, embeddedness in connection, the oral indigenous frame of 25,000 years ago in our cultural consciousness is archetypally balanced feminine, okay? Then the argument I believe that's at least the most spiritually appealing is that we're searching for justification narratives as people get more and more complex. They ask why? And then you do activate an archetypal masculine search for the analytical answer for this, okay? And then there's a argument, God, a Human History by Aslan, who argues that like temples in Göbekli Tepe in Turkey may have been the seeds. The building of these temples and the large scale nature of them may well have been the seeds of agriculture. Okay. So in other words, people are getting more and more, they need more and more ritual. The clans are expanding, things like this.
And I believe we couldn't have agriculture until, from a Marxist view, there was a class that didn't have to do subsistence.
Well, then, you then, stuff, right? So the argument is now we're building these temples, okay, which by the way means the drive for the concept of God and the honoring the concept of God then sets the stage for agriculture and the transition into civilization. So my atheist side's like, oh God, If the concept of God drove humanity towards then the next phase, which is the traditional, the traditional formal phase, okay? Some people call it traditional, it's civilization. So civilization then emerges from, say, 12,000 years to 5,000 years ago. It's certainly in full swing by 5,000 years. And then you get the building of cities, of course. You get writing, you get the educated class, and then you actually now transition. With the wealth, you transition into elite male dominance. Okay? Yes. So the Bronze Age civilizations and the Axial Age civilizations, there are very few genuinely matriarchal or even balanced civilizations.
Yeah.
And the reason I think is because the archetypal nature of the male is more interested in taking risks. They're more structured and interested in taking risks to accumulate more and more wealth. If you do a basic evolutionary calculation on this, you can argue that the more a harem for a man offers all sorts of reproductive success. A harem for a woman, not so much because of the reproductive constraints. So the risk taking and the drive to gather more and more control over everything is. And
I would argue that complexity levels are increasing, which means there needs to be, whether it's man or woman, a masculine mind ordering complex systems in order for them to be efficient and effective at feeding the polis and ... So we needed a masculine boost,
totally.
right?
It's a complicated algorithmic institutional structure
Absolutely.
that then has to be ordered in a particular kind of way that is less relational and more hierarchical.
Absolutely.
To make it work. So then you get traditional systems of knowing, which then give, first you get Bronze Age, and then that collapses, then you get Axial Age, and Axial Age then seeds the traditionalist ways of knowing. And the East then is embedded in practical philosophy more and has those particular wisdom traditions. The West then, especially through the Greeks and then into 500 years ago. So interesting, 50,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, now 500 years ago, more or less, you get the Western Renaissance into Enlightenment and the birth of modern science, okay? And then modern science then elevates rationale, transcendent egoism, to use concept of pure rationality yielding pure truth that then systematizes everything, and then the capital industrial labor market in relation creates a hyper masculine structure. I have here, you probably have read this, Richard Tarnos's The Passion of the Western Mind.
Funny enough, someone who Greg Thomas, sent me, he read my recent essay, and I read it years and years ago, and he resent me the epilogue. Said,
yes, actually, Greg Thomas was my seed for this too.
Reread the epilogue, and I was like, I haven't done it yet because it was only a couple of days ago. He sent it to me.
Okay, well,
I was like, yeah. So you carry on, as Tarnas says.
So, and then Tarnas completely articulates this is a hyper masculine sort of thing. Absolutely. And here's the last. So you have a feminine, a balance to feminine. Then we get imbalance to traditional. Then we get actually even more imbalance. I would argue that actually the postmodern critique, at least in all of its forms, does have a feminine twist. Or a feminine
spirit. Well, it's interested in relational justice in some ways, right?
Yeah, it's care. In fact, Steve McIntosh in his Developmental Politics argues that care fundamentally, at least at the social justice and political movements, can be argued to be the fundamental. At the social justice critique, it's about, hey, the hierarchy and power is imbalanced. Who have been the marginalized voices that have not been included in the relational web?
Absolutely.
We need to give value to those individuals. And in terms of political movements, it's not generally more feminine in architecture. It also is a return to the care of Mother Earth. Okay, so in environmental,
you could read socialism as a feminine archetype that was then hijacked by
by masculine totalitarian
hyper-masculinism again.
Totally. Exactly. Well, because part of the problem, and this is something we really have to be aware of, is to control large-scale systems, you're going to get a masculine bias dominance in that structure. I've always said we need a lot more women in power. I've also always said it's going to be really hard. Women will tap out in relationship to it, and men will go more towards it based on a certain energy.
One of the quotes that Foucault, so I'm actually a Foucauldian, so I am a postmodernist in some ways.
Yeah, Foucault is brilliant in my estimation.
I'm a mystical postmodernist who also believes in constructing and building and regenerating. And we can come back, and that's why I love the regenerative frame that's emerging in the last 5 years. But one of Foucault's quotes I love is, I misquote it, say, how small and weak and marginalized do you want to make me when you say I am a scientist and I am doing science? And that was one of the bits of the postmodern, the feminine postmodern, that says, no, we are not going to be pushed into a spreadsheet, which brackets was how essentially the Holocaust occurred, was the spreadsheetification of the Prince 2ification of humanity. Totally. And this desire, the feminine desire within the postmodernism, but it's also became, if you read, Derrida, it's again hypermasculine hijack of the impulse of pulling power down, masculine power down, and said, we are still equals.
Yes.
You may be more useful in the hierarchy. For the hierarchy's ends, you, CEO, prime minister, whatever, you may be more useful, but of value as human beings, we are still equal and have to always be.
Love it. Yeah. And that, so for me, one of the things that I do, that I totally agree that we're on the edge of something. I mean, and just project what the hell this emergent thing's going to be. I mean, all you can do is say, hey, this is some frame, and that will be different than whatever the hell you project. Yeah. But I do believe, and especially, the fact that, it's Lenny Rachel Anderson's version as a woman, I can say, oh my gosh, that version of modernity that aligns these four sensibilities and then invites us to cultivate a cultural sensibility, code, and consciousness that embraces oral indigenous, traditional, formal, modern, and postmodern, feels like it sets the stage for an inclusive. And notice she gets out of it, carries a lot of Wilbur's kinds of stuff. You know, it's got some of that.
Transcendent include.
Transcendent include, and has a stage kind of model, but it isn't get you into second tier. I mean, Wilbur's model is very hierarchical. People will clamor, I'm on the next color and I'm the next stage. And now can I be second
Who are
tier?
you to say that you're teal?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very, purple. I mean, I can jive with that at one level, but it's actually a hierarchical dynamic. So what this basically is it then puts it much more in a horizontal circle. And I think it basically says, shit, man, we are out of balance. You know,
yes,
we are way out of balance. And it orients both, it embraces the feminine critique, the postmodern feminine critique. It critiques postmodern by saying, actually, you're just a critique, really. You're not.
You've got to build. You've got to build. We've got to build.
Got to build. And if we're going to get back into balance, you go back to the horticultural Venus structures and basically a relational webbing. You know, is completely. And I like it also because, like with the tree back there, the left-hand side is theory, which is the masculine, and then it switches over to the unified approach and ends with calm MO, which is arguably the most feminine aspect, curiosity. No, I lost you there for a second.
You just glitched out on the feminine aspect. I totally get it. That's where we got back to, in my language, interoceptive awareness, stillness, presence, right?
Totally.
Listening to my body's deviations from what we call the midline, above and below, left and right, midline, slightly triggered, slightly in the rational, slightly threatened, slightly trying to play a status game, ... whatever it is. That interoceptive awareness brings us right back into the feminine, but we can still stretch up into the stars. And it is Taoist, because the Taoists are trying to bring heaven down to earth, but cognitive complexity tries to bring earth up to heaven. And we've got to have the return path. And one of the things that you said, I just want to riff off, because this is one of my areas of upgrade at the moment. I'm like, as well.
Right.
Partly because I believe this regenerative lens allows us to bring multiple tribes, frames, systems together and build, not just critique. But we'll maybe come back to that. So one of the things I think I love about Lene's work, who I quote in my last book, I loved her model, and I've sort of riffed on it a little bit myself. And what it allows us to do, as well as transcend everything and include everything and not critique anything too much. And it's like a coaching model. It's like, you know, some of this patterning, you got to let it go, dude. It's not working for you anymore. What we call in art, it's a mismatch. And mismatch is, that's why I love evolutionary theory, because it creates this idea of mismatch. It's not good or bad. It's just a mismatch for the moment. You don't have to make a big thing out of it, right? And what it also shows us in this meta-modern emergence, let's not call it stage theory in the Wilberian sense. Let's call it like more your tree. It's more like it recapitulates your tree, right? But it also recapitulates our consciousness, because I think we can all get meta-modern by opening up, releasing all these old theories and beliefs and patterning around structure, hierarchy. I'm the boss, but now we're all equal. And as I said, I love saying there's nothing worse. There's only one thing worse than tyranny from above, from the patriarch. It's tyranny from below, from the consensus and the need for consensus, which people call woke, Wokistan. And you know all about it. Let's not go there. So what I love about this emergent societal model, it recapitulates psychology and ultimately hermetic truth, as above, so below. It cannot be any different. If we don't the phylogeny, recapitulates blah blah blah, embryology, you can see this emergence of structure and complexity. And what this model allows us to do is go, this is one of my pet peeves at the moment, is the fetishization of the shaman and the animistic cultures. And IK, indigenous knowledge, it's like the answer. No, it's got stuff we've forgotten or misplaced, I would actually say. And I love reading some of the meta-modern work within the scientists who come from indigenous traditions. It's a reminder. It's like, come back home to relationship, come back home to reciprocity, to interdependence. Or rather, it's an invite to the future, because one of the things I keep saying to people is you cannot go back to a Dunbar number of 150 in a tribe where the shaman was responsible for that number of people. It was low levels of complexity. You didn't have to organize a water system that brings stuff in, or electricity, blah, 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 blah. Can't go there. Let's not go back. but we can go back to the future and bring that animistic, reciprocal, interdependent relationships, but into a complexity level at the level of the global health system, the economic system, all these different things. So we avoid the pre-trans fallacy, in other words.
Yep, totally.
And that's also the fetishization of psychedelics, which is happening at the moment. Similar issues that we know. Other things that I really wanted to just pick up on what you said is how, so Jung talks about this idea that essentially bits of the other balance, where we're out of balance, bits of the other will pop up and create crisis, right, in some way. I believe he called it enantiodromia. And I may have got that, pronounced that wrong. But the idea that in a normal human experience, we will get pulled into crisis, turning point, which we call a transformation curve. We'll get pulled down it. We either swim down it on purpose, which is what happens when you start to get the transformation process, that you have to go down before you go up. You have to release before you receive. So you start to do that preemptive. You go, I'm feeling out of match with the world. I'm going to proactively go within and see where I'm holding trauma, pain, wounding, beliefs, assumptions, behaviors, addictions. I'm going to proactively release them so that I receive the next bit of my journey, which is where, which is what's happening to you, right? You are proactively allowing channel, but we don't have to call it be weird in a weird way, but I'll come back to that in a second. It's really important that we account for this, right? We have to account for mystical, creative flight and the fugue state of creative expression. But then that enantiodromia, that pulling of the opposite, then puts us back into the midline again. So I believe in biology and in society, we have a midline, which is what you would call the balanced feminine, I think, in a slight, I would say the midline is 51% feminine, 49% masculine. Just because if it's the other way around, we're slightly more threat response, hypervigilant, right? And given in complex society, we're not, unless you're right now in Israel, but we're Palestine, But most of us are not in a threat state, in a physical threat state. So we don't need to be 51% masculine. We're back in the midline. And society has the same. So you had the modern explosion, and then you had the romantic, trying to pull it back to a midline, but way too pendulum. And the challenge always has been in human beings, we're not very good at harmonizing. We're all about pendulum. So you have postmodernism, and then you have this extreme version of a sort of Peterson style, brittle and a bit aggressive, and then it pulls. It's not harmonizing.
Totally.
And that's the Taoists again. They're always talking about finding balance with nature, harmonizing with nature, which is what the shamans talk about. And I love that the society and psychology are all replicating this desire to be in this midline where the notochord embryo can unfold into human, and then into society, and then into meta, and then and so just really love that story. But let's talk about that channel state where you had, because this is where this dual aspect, non-duality can, I won't say account for from a scientific point of view, but it can understand / explain, somewhere between the two.
Right.
So if we agree to some degree, consciousness is in everything. Pantheism, panentheism, panpsychist, pansubjectivist, paninterior. Let's call it paninteriorism. There's an interiority to everything, but at levels of complexity where you get through the sort of Tonioni level of a mammal.
Right.
Let's say a crow.
Definitely by the time you're at a crow. Yes.
I go
down into insects actually myself. I can go all the way down.
I'm speeding to crow because they blow my mind, right? We've got a lot of crows around here in the garden. Yeah. And since the lockdown, I've done a lot more, what do they call it? Twitching, tweeting, bird watching. You can tell it's not my genre, but I'm being called into this reciprocal, interdependent relationship with nature. And I'm watching the crows. I'm like, these guys are definitely got some levels of consciousness. I can commune with them. I can have like a little eye-to-eye thing, and he's eating my grass seed, and he sees me, and I know he sees me seeing him, ... So we've got consciousness within, but consciousness we know has to somehow connect with a quantum field of some sort because it's everywhere, and it has to
say
be
about this.
Yeah, there has to be some kind of string. I don't know what it is. I don't care what it is. I'm not, I care in that I'll read a book about it.
Well, I'll give you some.
I know you will. I know you will. And going back to Bohm's idea, of implicate explicate world. Yeah. So if you've got the implicate world is the field of our consciousness, and we've got the explicate world as a field of actualized stuff in the world. Okay. What I fundamentally believe is us humans are the highest level of complexity, organism, organizing theory, organizing system, algorithm in the known universe.
Totally.
Seems to be one of only a few species, and potentially the only one that can do it fully consciously, fully intentionally.
Yep.
Channel content, non-local information from the possible world to the world of actuality, which is what happens when we build or we write or we code. And one of the things that I say to people who are in the innovation space, or the creative space, who are usually not known for their mysticism, is like, if you really do innovation the way I've done it, hundreds of organizations, thousands of teams, tens of thousands of leaders, and always novelty will emerge, and it's usually co-creative, and it's usually it's evolutionary. It's a fit for the emergent reality that's coming, and it often happens in multiple places at the same time. Hence, metamodernism is now popping up independently.
Totally.
You cannot be anything other than a mystic if you appreciate creativity, because it's channel of the conscious realm into the material realm, and you and I and everyone watching this gets to consciously choose what to do with their 70, 80, 90 years of that capability.
Let's consciously evolve.
Totally. And let's build something.
And build something. Right?
Yeah. That doesn't destroy someone else. That's the general rule.
Build something wise. And loving, right?
So tell me about your strings and things.
Okay, there's actually a couple things that we need to. I want to get into rationality and relation. We touched on that, and
perfect.
So definitely want to say that. And I want to tell you. I'll go this way. So I'm going to go down. You talked about interoception.
Yes.
Right? So John Vervaeke and I, have been engaged in a journey on syncing up on the science side here, but this is going to come right into our heart. Okay.
Yep. I'm sure it will.
Okay. When I do Calm MO, and I encourage people to do Calm MO, that's the psychological mindfulness stance. I say calm body, calm heart, calm mind, calm spirit.
Absolutely.
Those are the layers. Basically you have a perspectival view. You go down into the body. Okay. Heart really is your relational heart in the relational world. There was, the limbic world of attachment and connection. Mind, in this case, I mean the narrator, okay, the talking narrator and justifier. And then the spirit is aligned with whatever your ultimate values are. Okay, so you want to then, and the idea of vertical integration here, where you're seeking some degree of coherent integration.
Absolutely.
What happens when you get distressed, and all of a sudden you get all these different modes, okay, and people split. And I talk about all this time. If you're in a defensive place, like you start attacking me, then I will get defensive, okay? And then it splits. And then I get often a defy defer split. So the defy is, fuck you, Nick, I'm coming back at you. That's my anger, my hostility, my contempt on the one hand. Or, oh my God, Nick, you're right. I'm really sorry. I'm inadequate. That's defer. I'm shamed. I'm guilty. Okay. And these actually pull you in very different polar opposite views. Okay. And it's very difficult to find an effective, harmonious opponent process.
And you go to black and white. And can't find the third way. The splitting is the ultimate black and white, right?
Right.
Which is the personality disorder coming in that we all have capacity for, right?
That's right. And you can feel it if you know behavioral investment theory. The argument is actually your neurobiological consciousness system is looking for passive investment. And I can't simultaneously, although people with borderline bounce back and forth, this is what makes them erratic. You can't simultaneously defer and apologize on the one hand and be super angry in extreme ways. Now, a skilled communicator holds that exactly. So the skilled communicator holds the desire for connection on the one hand and the desire for self-protection on the other, and creates an effective opponent process that is both friendly and assertive, and shows the utility of that. But the splitting. So anyway, John and I have been exploring that. Now let's go down to layers. The reason I started there is because into body. Okay.
Yeah.
So John and I's exploration of what consciousness is we're syncing up. I have what's called behavioral investment theories, evolutionary, neurobiological into basic structural, that invests and utilizes pain and pleasure as the foundational nature's guide. Okay. And John had built a model of consciousness that has that was really interesting in terms of having an adverbial framing observing function that then brings onto the screen of adjectival awareness. So he split adverbial awareness in terms of, and evidence for that in terms of what he called the pure consciousness event. Okay. Pure consciousness events are meditators who can basically zoom back and hold their attention until all things disappear except just the pure conscious experience of being. So they don't even have, there's no, and I'm not a meditator, so I can only speak, but John is, he certainly experienced this, many advanced meditations. The adjectival features of consciousness disappear and you're left with the here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness of the observing function. So that's really interesting. And John uses that to say that actually for qualia, we should separate qualia in terms of adjectival and adverbial, okay? Now I was like, well, wait, that's really interesting because for me, qualia emerge out of pleasure and pain. Okay? And then he and I got talking and then he was like, well, actually, pleasure and pain then can be thought of, okay, as the a priori field condition for the emergence of this adjectival and adverbial framing system, okay? All right, so we get into that and then I start researching, and in particular, a couple of really interesting books, okay? Like this book, and very appropriate in terms of its title, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what is the evolution of the sensitive soul? It's an argument for the ancient origins of consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay? And it says that consciousness fundamentally organizes when a system, an animal system, can figure out how to learn. Okay, it has an unlimited learning potential. Now, how does it do that? Well, here's what we get into. It consolidates the information between the exteroceptive system, which is the sensing, detecting, the exterior agent environment arena. Okay.
Absolutely.
It ratios that or puts that in relationship to the interoceptive system.
Yep.
Okay. Which is the homeostatic state of the body, which says, hey, what is going on that's good and bad? And then it orients it in reference to the energized motion, emotional system. Okay, that then tells and guides the body to do something about the relationship between the exterior and interoceptive system.
Which is where negentropy pops in, because you get life coming from this.
This is the guiding system that generates the complex adaptive system that allows you to navigate the collection of free energy in relationship and preserve the work function. And what that suggests is the field. This gets back into why your interoception and when I do calm body.
Yeah,
it's basically the root of the conscious field.
Absolutely.
It's detection of what's going on out here relative to the interior state, relative to its needs. That gives the positive and affective valence flavors that create the field of experience. So now all of a sudden you actually have, wait a minute, this electromagnetic energy information field system that's about putting gas on toward something in a pleasure sort of way, breaking something and moving away in a pain sort of way. So now all of a sudden we have this idea, we have a pretty clear idea, or at least a pretty clear coherent argument, that there's a neurobiological energy information field, okay? That's about positive and negative, and that's potentially creates.
Has to always be about there has to be antagonistic pair.
Yep.
I believe nature can't learn, move, grow, expand without antagonistic pairs.
And this gets into positive opponent processing.
Hence why we get the dual aspect non-duality, because we need to break up. And in the Tao, first there's the Tao, then the yin and yang, then the 10,000 things, which is everything, diversity. We need a breaking apart of unity to get into opposites, although we must always remember they're one thing, not two, which is the middle way. That adversarial dialogic, slightly against but also together, allows movement. It allows in every sense of movement. Change,
it's dynamic, right? It manages all sorts of order, chaos. It manages all these polarities.
Tricep, bicep. Without, as I say in my workshops, if you just had a tricep, you wouldn't be able to do very much. You need these antagonistic pairings.
So the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, but is then now. So okay, so there's that. Now let me go all the way down, okay, and basically now pull up a particular frame of reference that then says, all right, so what happened in the 20th century is we actually realized that matter is not, everything doesn't clearly reduce to matter because there's shit underneath matter, okay? There's stuff underneath matter, and both quantum mechanics and general relativity teach us this. General relativity teaches us about the expansion of the universe and therefore its contraction down into Big Bang, which can only then, or at least the vast majority of accurate models of Big Bang, point to a crystal clear picture. The universe begins as an energy information singularity. Okay, that's the picture of the general relativity. Quantum field theory, which emerges out of quantum mechanics, changes the idea that there are these particles and forces and basically drops them all into energy information fields.
Absolutely.
Okay. So now we can say quantum mechanics into quantum field theory and general relativity point to the base of matter being energy information fields. Okay.
Which
that
may be something or no thing.
Well,
to be,
right.
To be discussed.
To be discussed, right? But here's
either emptiness or form. It doesn't really matter.
Right. Well, now you have a contrast. Right. Now there's a positive statement of the thing and the no thing in relation. Okay.
Exactly.
And now we can then say the thing is an energy information field at its root. So I've now been surveying all the quantum mechanics perspectives, and I would argue that actually energy information fields are things that all the quantum perspectives afford. They all say, actually, yeah, these two conceptual metaphysical ideas, actually, the energy information field is the most generalizable way to talk about the quantum energy. Okay.
So in that the three main descriptions of quantum empiricism, I mean, ultimately in my very hacky way of saying it, there's a realist, there's an idealist, and there's like somewhere in between. And beneath that, we can agree that there must be some web, field, string.
So I would argue that everybody now is, all the common quantum field people are now into quantum field theory. They've gone from quantum mechanics to quantum field, so that particles and forces are considered by virtually everybody as emergent functions, as fluctuations in the field.
Absolutely, which is ultimately a relational,
which is very relational and contextual.
Indra's net sort of style metaphor.
And the Big Bang says that the four force fields of electromagnetic, gravitational, strong and weak nuclear, maybe there's a fifth, whatever, but he would say the same thing, are all emerge out of at Big Bang, the point of transformation starting with the Planck epoch. So you go from the first break is the electromagnetic field, which, by the way, starts with a weird polarization between electricism, magnetism, and charge. And then that creates a space dynamic, that creates a gravitational force, and then the strong and nuclear. So, by the way, this shows that causal forces emerge out of, and there's complicated dynamics about what is caused metaphysically. But anyway, they emerge out of, at least in a time dynamic, on a time dynamic, and the actual experience unfolding of energy and entropy. There's a time dynamic in the real, actual, from potential to actual universe. That is what happens. And then you get the emergence of these forces. So you have energy information at the general relativity base. You have energy information field theory at all the quantum bases. So now what we have is the right model for thinking about the universe is energy information fields. Okay. Well, Jesus, Nick, if we start talking energy information fields, that's a great way to describe my own coin perspective.
Right.
I mean, what am I? I'm this sort of like I have this subjective portal, okay, that has to have something, so some energy in it, and it's representing shit informationally. So the idea now that we couldn't figure it out before because we had this sort of matter and motion mechanics. If energy information field theory is a hell of a lot more congruent, and if everything's energy information field all the way down, that's a kind of consilience that sets the stage, and maybe all the way up.
Well, I was just going to say, so let's go back to Lene's emergent social stages, starting with the balanced feminine. You could argue that if the universe starts with a field, with a relationship, with a net, with an Ubuntu, with an interbeing, interdependent, reciprocal relationships that are many and one and nothing and something, they are neti, not this, not that. They are sunyata, but they are Brahman, they're Atman, whatever, to be discussed. Then we went to a masculine. Exactly. We then went to a masculine where we saw stuff, atoms, back to the atomists of the Greeks. Up to now, we went blah, 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 stuff. Oh, back to the feminine again. So we've kind of got, there's a recapitulation of the regenerative shift, the meta-modern shift within a scientific world that is coming back towards relationship and away from
beautiful
vertical. It's getting horizontal, right? Or more horizontal.
Horizontal.
We don't get rid of the vertical because I love this camera being a thing. It really works for me.
Right. No,
I love you being a thing, but I also love you being a process, whatever. And then we're getting into the process theorists and the philosophers. I want to riff. There's some huge synergies. And I want to. So you said at the beginning of your last flow about, let's go back to the interoception, right? Let's go back to the individual, their disembodiment, their disassociation, the splitting, the black and white, what we call in our work, create and control mode versus, create and connect mode versus control and protect mode. You've got this, you've got this lack of congruence within, that your mind and your heart and your felt senses and your behaviors are no longer congruent, which then causes ructions for everyone else in the system, which is why, for example, the borderline chaos, lack of truthfulness and chaos pushes out the pain into other parts of the system. And we all have these tendencies, right? So,
no, obviously we carry those potentials. Yeah.
And but then when we come back into congruence, inner congruence, we get, I believe, this thing that I now call jouissance, the French sort of orgasm, joy, flow feeling, which you could call kundalini, rising, below, then we've got this sense that there's energetic alignment where we're not neurologically distorted through unprocessed shock in the nervous system.
Totally.
Hence, we're bringing now Alison, my wife's working around the storage of energy that was not released at the time because it couldn't be processed because it was too awful, and the belief that you weren't safe with your parent, ... So repressed. But when we unlock that, we get congruence, coherence and congruence, which then allows for coherence with others. Hence why I believe, but just to riff on that until we have the relational coherence together on the horizontal, me and you, we can't build this next level of human society.
People don't feel safe, and there's inequality and all that.
And we're just not coherent with each other. Yeah, we're not in love with each other. We're in rightness. And one of the great sayings is you can't be right and be married. We can't be, my new saying, we can't be right and be regenerative. That would be my next thing. So anyway, carrying on with your flight. So then you said about this book you're reading about the external and the internal, which absolutely chimes with our transformation process. And it has to, right? Because otherwise we're all barking up the wrong tree. So we talk about this idea that you've got an environment coming in. We know that, senses. And then we have this environment, which is now our interoceptive state and other things. And our job as organisms is to align. When there's a mismatch, there's an alignment which allows for essentially growth and coherence to reemerge, which is the impetus to move, to grow, to change, to transform. All the same word for one thing.
Energized motion, emotion, by the way.
Emotion. Remember Tony Robbins on stage going, "Motion is emotion." I'm like, yeah. But he's right. Emotion is the royal road to change, not the low road. And as the work of Feldman Barrett around really only four emotions: towards, away, high and up and low, as you said, valence and arousal, right? Everything else gets meaning systems cognitively packed on it, which is nothing wrong with that. That's just part of the joy of our narrative confabulatory structures, which helps us create sense. Boom.
Crucial.
Thank you, cognition. Love it.
Justifiability.
Absolutely. And so in our transformation process, we describe it as a J curve, right? So imagine a J, you're starting, is this on your left of your screen? My finger? Or is it the right?
Yes.
Left. So you realize there's a mismatch between your environment and your environment. Probably because if you're listening, you're getting environmental signals that something isn't right. Threat, fear, disconnect, weirdness, They don't love me. I don't know. You're getting external signals which is not working, which is, oh, I'm getting divorced. Oh, I keep coming away from relationships before. I keep getting sacked. I keep whatever. So then you proactively or not go on this curve that goes down into the mystical, the possible world, the dipping into mindfulness, emptiness, whatever version of that. Right. And then you come out and you build, but you build higher than you were before because you've now got a better fit with the order structure. So we talk a lot about fittedness, not just fitness. So if you think about antagonistic pairs, fitness is a description of the evolutionary value of something. Fittedness is a description of the horizontal relational match.
Yes, yes.
And then growth has occurred. And then, as you said, you get these moments in your life. That is the transformation curve. We call this transformation curve. That is the transformation curve, or an enantiodromia, or a strange attractor pulling you into a next level
criticality, reorganization.
To grow, to reorganize, to come, to thrive, to fit more, which I believe we can all have many of these in our lifetime. And you have minor key ones and major key ones. And the major key ones are what Keegan or Wilbur might call a stage
jump.
Stage jump. And the minor key are little bits that build
a learning experience. Absolutely. A meaningful learning experience.
And I think if you have multiple minor key, then you get a major key.
You're praying yourself for that kind of shift. Yeah.
Exactly. And so you get this amazingly transformational process, which is deeply wedded into the system of being. It's just the system of the universe. Whether you talk about wave becoming quark, let's just call it, to totally show my ignorance of physics. When field becomes quark, it then becomes
strong field force gets a perturbation that jumps into a quark. I'm with you.
Or when you get, the what do you call them? The flavors of particle when they turn into charm. You get charm. So you get the splitting again of unity into two, and so two can learn, two can move, two can grow, and then but we often get stuck in thinking we're two, and that I am not you and you're not me, and that I'm not feminine because I'm a man. Blah blah blah. History of the world,
right?
And hence we need to always remember that we're one, but also two, one, but also two, which is a really great general sort of heuristic for leadership.
We're reason in relation.
Exactly. And that's where this relations thing is coming in. And then again, one of the things we always must remember, and that's why you said Lene has a more circular idea, but the developmental psychologists, most of them male, are going like this, right? We're going up. Like the classic consultant's diagram. The good thing is in the top right. The bad thing is in the bottom left. And we can take you here, baby. But we must always remember that this flight towards truth, rational cognitive complexity, up here towards the sky, is actually a circle that gets us right back into our interoceptive cellular state, back on the inside.
Totally. Love it. That's actually what the wisdom energy loop was, because I went back to the universe.
And then you're next thing you know,
and then went back.
You're walking, right? You're walking in nature, because it's an immediate regrounding of the energy.
Totally.
Back in what is here now, in the relational, in the earth.
Yeah, I was definitely one with the Big Bang when I was in it.
Totally. And so yeah, should we riff on this relational rational piece?
Absolutely, yeah. Why don't we do that and get a vision of what your future is? Let's go into the relational rational piece.
Fine.
It's so rich.
It's a good thing. So I've just gone through a 16-year, we could say 35-year, but 16-year major key transformation upgrade developmental stage. Wow. Which is ironic, because I described this stage in our 5 stages of development as a leader. I describe it in a book before I'd fully achieved it myself. Hence showing that theory can inform practice. Like, we need theory to show us what's possible. And that's the joy of the developmental stage theories, is that but rather than look at them as a critique that we're not there yet, you can look at them as this unbelievable possibility of how much learning and growth can occur in one human's lifetime. So let me sort of, and this is really like, we're talking about exactly the same flavor as the balanced feminine turns into the feminine, turns into the masculine, turns into the feminine. So for me, the 5 stages of a leader, not childhood developmental stage theory, adult stages, and these map onto Keegan's work, but they push it a little bit deeper into wisdom, into the feminine. And my sense is that we are all born in the feminine, because we're also reliant, right? We're totally dependent, so we have no hubris.
Oh, in that way, absolutely.
As well, right? So we're totally reliant on the mother, and we're relational because that's all we've got. We don't have thought. And then we develop rational thought. We develop the masculine, and we go out and we build things and we learn stuff and we learn how to fit into society, blah, 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 blah. You've heard it all before. And then I believe we pop out, ideally, at the stage of what I call a deliverer. So you're able to deliver to time, to quality, to budget, something of value to society in its current state.
Right. You've built some competence you can give to society.
And I always tell people we employ, and I tell people in workshops, you need to have a technical skill. Do not try and jump stage theories. Like if you're a Gen Zer who's trying to be a second tier teal genius, great for you. But meanwhile, get a day job and do some technical learning, right? Ideally, it should be in the thing you're interested in. You know, that's great. Be a workshop person, a systems person, write, whatever, edit. Then you pop out. Then you have the capacity to challenge that, the wisdom, the received wisdom, the rules. Probably because you're seeing anomalies. Let's go back to Kuhn. You're seeing anomalies pop up. Most people can't see it. You can see it, and then you pop into this innovator, what we call the innovator. And our world currently fetishizes the innovator. This is the Elon Musk. But it's usually still about self. It's usually still about overcoming some form of developmental pain that you weren't seen or heard enough, as much as it is delivering value to the world. It's a win-win for those two systems. And if you are willing to go further into relational, further into yourself, into your felt sense, into interoception, into relationship with someone else, intimate, because all of these are different tools to get relational, right? Meditation, marriage. I should say, new program, meditation or marriage. Choose one. Both
one or the other. I went with marriage myself.
Both are free.
Well.
And if you can bring yourself deeply grounded back into that relational truth, whether it's in the the mycorrhizatic nature, whether it's in your communion with a tree, whether it's in having a child, whether it's in loving the world so much, you can then rebalance your innovatory desires into a genuine purpose-driven form of action in the world, which I think would equate to Keegan's self-transforming mind. So you've got the self-improving disruptor's mind, and then you've got this transformational mind. The challenge you've got, and I think that the quality of the transformational mind, we call them transformers, and I've talked about them as a culture hero, because that's a nice sort of framing, but it's just a way. It's surrendered servant stewardship. So there's 3 words I'm using at the moment. Surrendered, as in you are listening to that channel. You are not hubristically. You are being guided by your your environment, not just your environment.
Right.
Intuition, insight, imagination, which is I think the 3 qualities of the environment, and it's refined. You are serving the world genuinely, but within a way that doesn't impoverish you. You know, the worst thing you want is what I call purpose orphans and purpose widows. Because we're so busy changing the world, we're traumatizing our children. Nice. And it's stewardship. So it's not afraid to be hierarchical. It's not afraid to say, thanks for all the consensus, everyone. I'm sorry, I'm going to do something totally different, because that's what I think is best for the world. You've still got a beautiful generative hierarchy. You can call it a transformational leader, a transformer, whatever. And I truly believe, and this is what I think would be called a second tier thinker. I truly believe we can't get there until we shift the masculine from the feminine. So I've always been a masculine lead with a feminine inner that I felt I had to protect because it wasn't seen or heard. This artistic trans type energy. And until this is from personal experience, until we flip to our masculine power and strength and rationality is now in service of feminine relational presence, love, connection, kindness, compassion,
right,
we won't even get to the stages of complexity we need.
Right.
Because they need to come back.
They need to be in balance.
They need to be, well, I think, I call it a threshold. I don't think you can get to truly, you can get to systemic complexity, but I don't think you can get to regenerative complexity where you see the webs of life, from the quantum field to the mycelial field, to the social field, to the global complex network that it moves towards thrivable outcomes, not extraction and exploitation.
Right.
Without that relational shift, let's call it a relational shift or a repair.
Yep.
And that's my critique of the current meta-modern movement.
Gotcha.
It hasn't quite done the inner work yet to live up to its outer work potentiality. And I'm going to tell you one more story, and then I'm going to be, as they say in Clubhouse, I will be complete, which is part of this transformation happened, and this is why I love stage-based theories, but also critique them.
Yes. My
son, who's 9 years old, a few months ago, my wife and I started sharing with him the idea of transhood or gender non-binariness.
Okay.
And he, by holding space, safe space, he decided he wanted to try on my wife's Chinese dress with makeup and stuff. He's often worn nail polish, right?
Yep.
We talked about not to be shocked or, none of that old patriarchal stuff.
Right.
I then asked him, who is this person? And what is this archetype within you? Whether you call it, voice dialoguing type idea or an archetype. Who is? He said her name is Kenya. No, he said his name is Kenya. And I said, when you're in Kenya mode, are you a she, or you? He goes, no, I'm a he still. I said, I was talking about, do you still think you'd have be a man? He's like, no, it's what I got from it was he was he's inhabiting this gender non-binary experience within him. Not all that, it doesn't want to do it all the time. It's just a piece of him. Okay. But it's the piece of him that's crushed in most of us. Right. And I think it's essentially Jung's anima in him. And from his breakthrough transformation opening, I discovered in the last few weeks, I have an inner archetype that I've been dialoguing with, doing some inner child work, which is at the core of our transformation work, who I've called Sky with an E.
Okay. Yes.
I told my son about Sky last night, and he was like transported by the thought that he'd inspired his father. And he knows we do this stuff for a living, right? He's been on our workshops.
Right.
And that's why I don't want to ever confuse these stages of development over necessarily age.
Right.
Particularly when we come into the relational embodied wisdom piece. I think it's hard to get a 6-year-old thinking about how to solve for a regenerative health system, although this same boy is working with my wife on a version of Monopoly where everyone wins. His idea, not ours. Right. He was like, well, so he started giving me money playing Monopoly. I was like, but that's not really the game, son. He goes, I don't get it. Why would you not want some money from me so you can carry on playing? And I'm like, the relational, that's the feminine, right? Keep playing. Let's not win, let's play. Right. And so I think I'm very hopeful, in summary, I'm very hopeful this regenerative turn, which I think brings together social justice warriors, ecological justice warriors, business people, developmental theorists, meta-modernists, I hope, potentially even spiral dynamic blue type formal order people. Well, I'm working on that, how we get them in, because it kind of goes against the Bible story about the planet is our dominion for humans, kind of story discord. This regenerative turn says we don't want to go back, we want to go forward. We want to not just take any part of what we've learned out of it. We don't want to fight, attack anything. Transcendent include bringing back the regenerative movement is definitely replete with animist, shamanic, indigenous knowledge types, bringing us back into this reciprocal relationship between us and a plant, between a plant and a fish, the salmonberry and the salmon, the sweetgrass, blah, 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 blah. And from that shift in our embodied consciousness will come business models, educational models, educational curricula, corporate structures, all of it can go through a full-on transformation curve shift to be fitted to a 9 billion yet one planet and one psychology reality.
Boom.
So that's what gets me
up the mic on that thing.
Because their meta theory and practice are aligned, because masculine and the feminine are aligned, right?
Yeah. No,
so the work you're doing, the work I'm doing in the theory is absolutely critical to allow the practice to evolve and to fill in the space. As you said yourself, we don't know the answers. We don't have to know the answers, because if we get in alignment, into receptive alignment, limbic alignment, cognitive alignment, we both get into channel, then we both come up with ideas. Other people somewhere else have the same ideas. We then have the technologies to meet our ideas up. We don't have to all build them ourselves. And that's the promise of the networked age. But I'm not, the jury's out whether we do it. Let's go back to that body.
My soul and spirit is feeling revitalized through a naturalistic ontology that all of a sudden affords us an enormous number of potential. That's just brilliant, Nick. That's just really touching and brilliant and moving. And
Amen, aho.
Amen, aho, man.
That's the indigenous Judeo-Christianic conversion.
Right. And this is the feeling, the feeling that when you, obviously, as I felt you and the energy that you have and the synergies and the coherent integration of different parts of yourself, and have gone through that myself, the beaten aspects and the split off aspects, and then having the opportunity to feel that coherent wisdom energy and whatever in relation, right, is so powerful. And I look across them as a clinician, as I know you do in relationship, just what we see, the suffering and the meaning and the mental health crises and what could be afforded so much more joy, and an opportunity for love and connection. And that's what my great hope is. And I think you articulated that potential vision just in a way that warmed my heart, brother. So.
Right back at you. You are the mirror. A new friend of mine, and I'm making so many new friends at the moment. Like we're new friends, right? Well, we're colleagues and we're fro leagues, as I've heard said. We've only met 3 times, I think 4 times.
That's amazing.
4 hours in total. And yet our field is, I would willingly put you up in my house, do whatever, support you in any way, right?
Totally.
But this coherence only occurs with this heart being healed enough from trauma and pain and suffering and oppression for us to be in alignment with ourselves, and for me not to pick up blocks to you and walls to you, status gains with you. I don't need to jump and make myself look cleverer than you. I'm happy for you to be cleverer than me. I'm happy for you to know shitload more than me, which you do.
I don't know about that.
And
in different ways.
Well, that's what I mean, because I don't need to peg myself to you.
Right.
Because I am pegged underneath with my conscious experience of the universe / nature / God. I'm a Spinozan ultimately.
All one,
And that's why Spinoza was a genius, because he's saying it's natural, it's ontological, it's coherent, and it revitalizes the soul and the spirit. Because this
an ethic. It gives an ethic.
It gives an ethic. It has to. You have to get from is to ought. And you can only do that when you bring matter, science, and wisdom together. But when you do, you get what you've been calling wisdom energy, which I've been calling jouissance, which someone else has called kundalini, or whatever you want to call it. And that lived experience of human beings coming into alignment to co-create a better solution than the one we have now. It's what got us here, and it's the only thing that's going to get us out,
Amen, aho.
Amen. I can imagine the emails. Stop appropriating my technology.
Right, well, oh, man. Anyway, that's a heck of a ride, Nick. That's a
Thank you for holding space for this friendship and collectorium. I would really love to the moment when it comes where we can get in a room and with a big whiteboard and
that's gonna be
sketch and totally. I think there's something what you were saying and what you were saying about the different. I just think there's so much room for, I know it's the word of the day, consilience. Remember reading the book by what's his name, the sociobiologist called
E.O. Wilson, right?
Yeah.
1997 that came out.
Exactly. Back to the 90s.
Actually. I developed the Tree of Knowledge and then read it right as it came out. I was running on the edge. I got the first copies. It's unbelievable. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Totally, and that's that intuition that there has to be a natural, innate, rooted in nature, yet knowing that nature is Deus, is consciousness, is God at the same time.
Have to have the whole.
Expanded nature, ontological, allows us to be practitioners, practical, and that revitalizes the soul and the spirit, and just being unashamed to own your S words.
Right.
Thank you.
All righty, Nick. Wonderful. Okay. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on. Deeply meaningful. So, boom. We'll end it there, brother.